All right. So let me just pull up my notes here. Okay, Shalom Uvracha. Welcome to the fourth installment of Three Opinions, a weekly initiative that explores the complexity of Jewish life, identity, culture, and theology, while also maintaining an appropriate amount of levity and upholding the age-old adage that whenever two Jews come together, there are three opinions. I am Rabbi Yoni, rabbi at Congregation Shaare Zedek in Metro Detroit, and with me this week via appropriate Corona protocol is the legendary Jess Katz. Jess is one of the first people I met when I moved to Detroit, full disclosure. And since that first meeting, I've heard her name on pretty much a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. So Jess grew up in the metro area, went to Michigan State, and then got her MA in education at Loyola in Chicago. She has worked for Moose Jaw here in Detroit, as well as serving and assisting some of the fastest growing and farthest reaching Jewish organizations in the area, including Kadima. We were both on the board together at Kadima, Next Gen Detroit, and The Well. And Jess now consults for and serves the Partners Detroit community. There's way more to add, but specific to the conversation we are having tonight, it's also critical for me to pitch. Hold on, I just had it with me. Where did I put it? There we go. For me to pitch the Jewish news story from their last issue, which covers Jess's travels throughout 2019 as the Joint's Ralph I. Goldman Fellow. The Joint, that is the JDC, or the Joint Distribution Committee's prestigious fellowship that goes to one individual internationally every year and allows for that person to quite literally travel the world, experiencing different Jewish communities, contributing time, thoughts, and energy to those communities, while also coming in with an open mind to take the experience of those different communities back home. So that is the longest introduction I've given to anyone so far, Jess. So you should feel really good about that.
Really too much, but thank you. Thank you for all of it.
For sure.
Really.
So before we dive in, because there are a few really important conversations I want us to have, I just want to say welcome home. We've had a chance to catch up a couple of times briefly since you've been back, but let me just say officially, and as a self-appointed ambassador for this community, that you are very much missed, and we are so happy that you're home and that we have no doubt a lot to learn from your travels.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. The timing of the Jewish news, I suppose, worked out pretty well. Yeah, no, it's great. It's great to be home, albeit it's an odd transition out of a year of travel into, quarantine. So
no doubt. Yeah. And the Jewish news article talked about that a little bit, but yeah, we'll see if we can get to that too, because that's fascinating in and of itself. So as you probably don't know, because when I asked you to hop on with me, I didn't actually explain this very well. And though this is
said yes.
Yeah, you just said yes, which I really appreciate, by the way. But the show is brand new. This is our fourth installment, and the purpose of what we try to do here is to chat, but to chat about some issues that might have a variety of different opinions, hence the title, and of course, in good Jewish fashion, to present those different opinions, to probably contradict ourselves in the process, because that's also a very good Jewish value, and to dive into a relevant topic as if we're almost like dissecting a page of Talmud. So if at any point I sound argumentative or kvetchy, I'm just doing some good old-fashioned rabbinics, okay? So I've already talked way too much, so why don't you take over for a little bit? So first, tell me about the fellowship itself. What is the intended purpose? What is expected of Goldman Fellows while they're traveling, and perhaps more importantly, when they return, when you get back?
Totally. So the fellowship itself is really incredible. I always kind of start off when I'm talking about it of like, it's as good as it sounds, in that it's sort of self-directed. So every year, the fellowship's been around for 30 plus years or so, actually. And it's really named in like one of the pieces of the intended purpose is to sort of, Ralph Goldman was a real human. He passed away maybe 5 or so years ago at the age of 100, and worked with JDC up until like the very end of his life. And so this fellowship really is like inspired by him and the work that he did. He did a lot of work in the former Soviet Union helping Jews. He did a lot of work. He was known, I guess, throughout the Jewish communities worldwide for his work. He was friends with David Ben-Gurion. Like, it's a really like inspirational human. And so I think part of the fellowship is kind of learn who he was, as well as like experience global Jewish communities, dive into whatever interests you or utilize your skills in some way with JDC, and come back and do something, be a Jewish leader with it. Like, it's really as almost broad as that. And so really fellows in the past have also, it's international, so there have been fellows from all over the world. And I do think that there's probably some difference of a fellow coming from the US versus someone coming from Israel versus someone coming from France or wherever else. And the expectation is typically, and I will say my fellowship year actually looked different, although all of them look different, but even just the setup of it is typically fellows have 2 or 3 placements where they're somewhere for 3 months or so and really get to know a community and do a project maybe in that community. My fellowship year ended up being between February and July. I was in a new place every week. Which is totally crazy. It was not like, I did not start out thinking that's what was going to happen either. I kind of like, we planned it as I went. And then I spent a little time in Israel and a little time kind of preparing. And I spent my last placement, the last few months was more like a typical placement where I was in Dubai in the UAE. I mean, there was nothing typical about that, but like,
I was just gonna say, typically in Dubai.
As of May of last year, I didn't know there was a Jewish community in Dubai. So like, there's nothing typical, but that was 3 months with the Jewish community and helping them there. So really, going into it, you go into it without a sense of really where you're going to end up. It's also looking at what's happening in the world and what opportunities exist. So a couple of times it shifted what work I would actually be doing. So the expectation is really like, learn what you can, or do what you want to do, what interests you. For me personally, it was Jewish community from my background, and Jewish identity is really interesting. I was fascinated by just global Jewish communities. Like, what does the world look like outside of America? I know American Jewish community. And so like this, to me, it was my opportunity to learn about anywhere else. And I like to travel, so it worked out. And again, I anticipate, and I packed as if I was going to be somewhere for 3 months at a time, not like moving every week. And then that all kind of worked out in the end. And then for what's important when you return, really their expectation is that you're going to be a Jewish leader in some capacity. Again, there's not a spelled out like, you will do this, this, and this when you return. It's as, I think the idea from JDC is, we're giving you these leadership skills and we're giving you all of this opportunity to learn, and we expect you will do something with that, but what that something is might look different depending on who you are as a person.
So do you still have an obligation to them, like to stay in touch and to like update them on different things, or?
I'd say not like a formal obligation. I mean, I think again, it's sort of like personally for me, I think there's a little bit of like wow, I had this experience. Of course, I'm going to stay connected.
Right.
And a lot of, for me, it was really soaking up what I could through the year and then like connecting people. They have a bit of a presence here in Detroit now. And I've like committed myself a little bit, but not in like not a formal, you will do this, this, and this.
Gotcha. I was just like reading the article and talking to you. I was like, there's no one else who could have adjusted to this year the way that you did, except for you. Not only in like the craziness of being in a different place every week for Shabbos, but even in like the Jewish news, I think did a really good job of like highlighting that last part of Dubai and saying like, oh, this was aligned with our interest as part of the joint, and just like went along with something that we were developing and working on this relationship, and was really good at just like stepping in when it was really appropriate to do so. I think that's hard for a lot of people. And like my hat goes off to you to just be like, okay, this is great. Let's go from here.
I will say there were moments, it's like one of those things you look back at and you're like, oh yeah, I did all those things. But like it was all the things it should be. It was definitely challenging. I definitely learned a lot about myself. I did used to think there was a few moments where I've said anyone could do this, and like it's not like I'm not using any crazy skills, but then I look back at certain moments and I'm like, oh yeah, I do have friends who like wouldn't be able to get past even the packing part of it. Like that's always, everyone always asks me about how do you pack? And I'm just like, I don't know, you just like wore the same clothes for a year. Like it's
For sure. I was thinking of like different people I knew who like, I think would be good fits for this. And I'm still like, so the Jewish news article opens with you in a Starbucks in Mumbai crying.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that would have been me and so many of these other folks weekly through you know. But that, I feel like that's really a testament to who you are, is just being able to roll with it. And that's a really powerful thing, an important thing that I think will come up a lot in our conversation tonight too, because a lot of I feel like a lot of the work that needs to be done locally and globally in Judaism involves holding on to kind of the Masorah, right? Holding on to tradition, but also being able to roll with things as they're happening, which we're seeing right now in some really unique ways with COVID.
Yeah.
But also with some of the sense of racial justice and social justice that's happening right now, which to the credit of a lot of movements and a lot of great organizations have really been beating the horn for not just years, but decades as part of our Jewish values. But everyone else is kind of forced to be catching up right now in that way.
I think I did a lot of listening. Like I'm a listener, like I'm someone who I love observing. And so I think in some of the places I was, even if I was uncomfortable or there was someone said something that was like, I don't know if I'm going to agree with that, but like if I'm in your sort of space and I'm there as the American who like doesn't speak your language literally anywhere in the world, then like I'm gonna like be in the moment and be here and like kind of reflect and figure out what it means globally later sometimes. And I think that did come. I mean, there were moments where I was like, okay, I have to check myself and then like check myself again of where am I and what am I doing and who am I and what am I representing? Because I also, different than people who are travelers and just pick up and go and like are keeping blogs and that's their whole, like that's how they're making money or that's what they're wanderlusting around the world, which is incredible. But like I was also in the majority of these places, like even if I wasn't doing work, like showing up and doing something, I was still there as JDC somewhat, or in an element of like, I'm here because I have this fellowship, and kind of understanding like, okay, who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? How does it all come together? So yeah, it was a lot. And I also think my ability to kind of walk in lots of different spaces and shoot, like I have some flexibility, like the flexibility of even Jewishly of knowing tradition and in some places feeling comfortable. I will always, and maybe this is one of your other questions, I always lean into the fact that like, because I know a traditional Jewish service, like a Friday night service, from a more, I can read the Hebrew and I can find my place in a Siddur, it allowed me in places where I had no clue what the sermon was about because it was in Hungarian. But like I could find my place to find a friend, and like that was always the most. I mean, that's what the India story sort of is, and like a number of them where. But I also recognize that I have plenty of friends who maybe wouldn't have felt that comfortable in a lot of those spaces, in that they might not have been able to find, they don't know some of these prayers or something else. So there's definitely that, like I was all over the place sometimes with that of like, wow, this is so incredible, but like, would someone else have had this experience? And trying to, navigate that.
For sure. So I want to ask you directly about that, but so here's my pitch: read the Jewish news. But for those who aren't going to read the Jewish news article, tell us the India story,
Okay.
just so people get a glimpse of what you mean here, because I think it encapsulates exactly where part of my question is going to come from as well.
I also will plug, I have a blog that I kept through the year. So if you really want to deep dive into a couple of these stories, you can go back. They're longer stories, but you're free to, and I can share that, or you can share it out or whatever.
Definitely.
So the India story is basically, I arrived in India. It was about 6 months. It was actually about a year ago. 6 months into this, like traveling every week and being somewhere new every single week. I had a layover in Uzbekistan of all places. In like middle of the night, like had to figure out where I was going. Almost like went into Uzbekistan, which I wasn't supposed to do because like I was just transferring planes. all good. Landed super hot. It's almost monsoon season in India, which is just like August here in Michigan, but like it never rains. It doesn't end up raining for 7 days, and you're just like, my hair was out to here. Tired, like hot, sweaty. I get to a hostel I'm staying at. The air conditioning isn't, like, they have no air conditioning. I decided to stay in a hostel to like meet people. That wasn't the type of place this was going to be. It just sort of spiraled. I said, okay, you know what? I saw on the map there's a Starbucks. Like, when you travel Starbucks, you at least know that there's air conditioning and Wi-Fi. So I take myself to Starbucks. I walk in, and like there was air conditioning. Can't get the Wi-Fi to work. And I just like, there just wasn't stopping the tears. It literally was just like, I don't want to make another decision. I spiraled into this whole place of like, I'm alone, I'm across the world. Like no one, you know, everyone's either sleeping or whatever that I'm going to talk to. And I just don't want to make decisions. What am I doing with life? Like really spiraled. It happened to be Friday, and I had already planned to like go to the synagogue that's there. And like, there was opportunities to go to a dinner. So I was like, I'm still going to go. Like, I just have to do this, take a deep breath and figure it out. And when I walked into the synagogue, it's like always my like, wow, I feel nourished. I walked into the synagogue. It happens to be in Mumbai. They have this really beautiful synagogue, and they had just redone it maybe within the last year or two. And it was, you know, walking into a service like I have heard across the world at this point, but like any Friday night service, I don't even know that it was a cantor or a rabbi singing. It was just like some guy singing. One tune was a little off. There were two women there that were super, super sweet and nice. They said, hey, come for Kiddush. Their Kiddush was really Shabbat dinner of like Indian food. So like, what's better than that?
That sounds
and
awesome.
it was just this like, I went from literally being like, what am I doing in the world, to having a Shabbat experience that was so nourishing. Like I walked away going, I'm so nourished. Like there was a guy from another place, he's saying nigunim that were beautiful. And I like witnessed the leader of the community giving like a really impassioned speech. It was just like all the things I needed in one day. And it was like, I remember the next day, I was like, oh my God, all those things happened in one day. Like,
Yeah.
it was like just one day of my entire year. But I do think it kind of shows like a lot of how the year went, and that it really was like up and down, and you have all these thoughts, but then at some point, like so connected to being literally on the other side of the world, and somehow sitting there and listening, like we're all saying these same words, and these, you know, even the challenges. I walked home, one of the leaders of the community like walked me back, so I didn't have to walk alone. And he was just saying like some of their challenges there are very, very different than what we have here. And like some of their challenge are young people are leaving. How do we, like, what do we do? You know, who is there for, you know, the young people leave because they want to marry someone Jewish. There's a very small community. There is a community, and that like there's actually like a huge, cool, historical Jewish community in India. Like it's incredible to learn about, but like it was just one of those sort of incredible moments.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that again is kind of a testament to who you are, because I feel like it's not a critique of this fellowship, but what I think could easily happen with this fellowship is, especially if the fellow is from America or Israel, that it shifts into this idea of we see ourselves, and maybe the entire Jewish world in some way sees Judaism as there's American Judaism and there's Israeli Judaism, and everyone else is in communication with that Judaism, right? And if you're a fellow who's from America or from Israel, it's hard to not fall into the place of like, here I am in Mumbai, let me tell you about American Judaism, or let me tell you about Israeli Judaism, to really give you more fulfilling Judaism, right? It's kind of like which is not so unique, because even all the way back in the Talmud, there's this kind of idea of the Babylonian rabbis who feel drastically superior to the Eretz Yisrael rabbis, but they only talk about those two communities. There are other communities, but they just don't really exist. And I feel like we do the same thing often, where we talk about Yerushalayim and New York. Like there's Jerusalem and there's New York, and then there's like some other stuff. And if we're being more gracious in kind of our own local way, then there's maybe New York, LA, and Chicago, and then there's everywhere else. So how do you, I mean, so that is, again, like you saying that you're walking into a synagogue and that is like for you, like just like refueling your neshama, refueling your soul, but also that you're there to listen, I feel like has got to be such a breath of fresh air for what we need as Jews. Especially with this conversation going on right now of just everyone in the world just feeling so like, I haven't been listening for years, right?
Right.
So how did you feel in that situation? Was that like part of was that on your mind as you were going in? Like, I don't want to be an American Jewish colonizer as far as, you know?
I think, so it's interesting. There's like two different directions. The first is I'd say probably maybe 2 months in, and the first part of the year was much more in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So Ukraine, Latvia, I was in Poland and Hungary. And I think a few weeks in, I had a shift. Like I did, well, actually, even before I left Israel and trying to figure out where I was going, I had a shift of like, I'm not this year isn't about me going and volunteering and doing a whole bunch. It's actually about me learning and like, let me learn so much this year that I do something after. And I think that was a really important shift in my mind, that I came into the year thinking like, oh yeah, you're going to go and you'll volunteer and you'll do something. And I think it's also like, the big conversation around like what you do on volunteerism sort of trips and like a lot of that kind of idea. But I think so for me, even before I left Israel, I kind of had this shift of like, okay, it's okay if I don't like do work in every single one of these communities. And like, there are other programs that maybe do stuff like that. So I think that was really important. And then I also think in being in the communities and recognizing that they don't need us in the sense of there are definitely communities that need, whether it's outside resources financially or the resources and have learned. And it's also one of like what I appreciate about what JDC does and has done throughout its history is really pivoting to the community is defined by the Jewish community is defined by the Jewish community of that place. And like, they're not there to come in and like, the goal is that the community becomes like self-sustainable and that it's teach them instead of do everything for them. And that can look really different in a lot of places. So I think for me, it was maybe it was in Riga or in Ukraine somewhere where I was meeting with young people and seeing their ideas about volunteering and what they were doing. There was like small programs they were running. And I was thinking, these are so creative. This is so simple and great. And we're not thinking of those things because we've been like doing this and we're like, oh, we did that before. And oh, we're not going to let this new program in. And I had that thought at some point of like, I'm not here to like give anyone, like here and there you can exchange ideas, of course, but like, they don't need us in that same way. The leadership opportunities and different things like that that they haven't had access to in some of these communities or haven't gotten to that place. But I think it's a really important thing for us Americans or North Americans, I would say, to often sort of check ourselves and I'd say, wow, it's not a matter of just going and seeing these people in other countries and like, oh, we need to help them. It's more of what can we learn from, like, I really did flip of what can I learn from them? How is it that, the teens of Riga that I spent 3 hours speaking with, like I thought I was going for an hour and we were still talking 3 hours later, were incredible. And they were so excited to be a part of Jewish community. And they were the ones encouraging their parents to actually want to take part and to go to camp and to do all of these things. And I was like, these are literally the things we are like pulling at some American teens to get, to be engaged in this way. And the same with young adults, like especially in the former, so some of those countries. In Ukraine, we spoke with young people who also were like so excited to be Jewish. So excited to learn. And look, a lot of it, and this is where I think we do have to learn history in order to kind of understand, especially in these places. But I also argue that you can't just learn history, you also have to learn today. Like, you also have to understand it's not the Ukraine of 50 years ago is not the Ukraine of today at all.
Thank God. Right.
Exactly. But like the impact of the young people are pulling it forward because they didn't get it from their parents and they didn't have anything. But like, what can we learn here from that experience, or how can we like bolster it in some way? So I don't know if I was like, I think that somewhat answered the question,
No,
but I
for
think
sure.
it's like, yeah, it was, I had a moment, and it was one where I distinctly now remember being like, I gotta remember this, and like, it's one of those, let me take it back of, it's important to see these places, but it's not, but we don't need to come in a way of, we know better. Actually, we can learn because you're more, you know, when you have like fresh, in some of those communities, it's like you can start from scratch, where we're so steeped here in the States, and even in New York or LA and even Detroit, like we're steeped in history. We are steeped in the traditions here. And that's obviously, you know, in many different ways, it comes across of like, what can we do that's new? Or maybe not new. Maybe it's just not doing anything new.
For sure. And we take it for granted, right? I mean, that's the problem with innovation. And that's the problem with, you know, creating a pride in Judaism in the first place. That's why I'm saying, like, for you, it's just so much better to have you going somewhere than someone with a guitar saying, let me teach you a Karl Bach tune that you probably don't know in Latvia.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to know Karl Bach. We have our own tunes. We have our own melodies. Like, we're okay with our culture. But when we're in communities where part of your Jewish life can be just taken for granted as your cultural upbringing, which is a lot of American cities, right? But especially like New York and LA, and even in Detroit, where there's a long, deep roots here, where you can talk about certain restaurants or certain neighborhoods without ever having to go to synagogue, or without ever having, you know, to have some kind of Jewish observance. And I will say, the one thing that you said was about North American Judaism, that I really think that as American Jews, we don't even think about Canadian Judaism in the same way. We just kind of lump Toronto as like part of us.
Right.
And like, that's the only Judaism we care about from Toronto, you know? I mean, or from Canada. Like, so sorry, Canadians, but I mean, I wish we cared more, because we should be listening to everything that's going on in Canada. There's great communities in Vancouver and Halifax and all kinds of places all throughout Canada. But we have these categorizations of, here's where there's vibrant Jewish life.
Yeah.
And those are the places where we should care, right? And everyone else could use our help.
Right. I mean, I always argue sort of this way. I feel like, especially traveling and being from Detroit, and even within some of the big organizations that are in New York, and I often say the coasts, and like, remember us here in the middle, like Chicago sort of literally fits it in the middle somewhere, because like, they are big, but also like they get mixed in sometimes, and maybe mixed like not so much other times. But traveling, I also sort of realized, you know, it was like, you forget we really are a big community. We don't consider ourselves often to be like big Jewish community, but we have 75,000 Jews here in the Detroit metro area. And that's a big community for the European communities, or for a lot of the communities in the rest of the world, even within the States. Like, there are small communities that exist that probably look more similar to some of the small communities in Europe than some of the experiences of Jews in New York. Right. And I do think it is like, especially now, I'm often saying like, the experiences that we have in small, I actually think there's something like beautiful about coming from a small community, because you are more connected in a lot of ways. You are more connected because you can't take it as for granted as much. I mean, we had a conversation. I was actually with rabbinical students in Ukraine from HUC. It was over Passover. And I remember like one of these conversations we kind of got into with young people from Kharkov. We were in Kharkov in Ukraine, and we got into this whole conversation about American Judaism and this, and it was sort of a reminder at one point, and I kind of said, look, we have to remember, like, we have even if you're not in New York, even in Detroit and some other smaller communities, we have 17 different rabbis that we can go to, and more than that, right? We have 17 institutions, if not even more, here in Detroit, and we have every element of whichever type you want, you kind of can find. And even if we don't have as diverse as it is in New York or LA or someplace like that, we have diversity of Jews here. Whereas in some of these communities, and not for like a lack of trying or whatever, the opportunities just aren't there, or they don't have as many voices sitting at the table, or just their traditions are so heavy and are so kind of stuck there that they've only seen one type of Judaism. So it sort of was like, oh yeah, wait, if all you know is this type of Judaism, that's all you know. You only can come to the table with what you know. And so I think it's something that like came up for me a number of times through the year of like, right, like we all take it for granted too much when you have more than one person that you can go to for an answer, to see something different. I just thought about this today. In Azerbaijan, in Baku, I was with actually a group of young professionals on a trip, and we went to this tiny village, which is still 95% Jewish. It's like the mountain Jews is what they're called, and it's super cool. There's actually locally, we have people who come from
I was just gonna say, yeah, we have a great community made up of folks from Baku.
It's really incredible. And so I was there, and there's a girls' school, and we were kind of visiting with them, and somehow I was like the person to answer all the questions. And one of the girls asked, like, I think she either asked, do you keep Shabbat, or like, what's your Shabbat practice? And here I have this very traditional rabbi, this is a very traditional community, looking at me. And like, he's the one teaching all of these girls who are in this school, and I'm just like, oh my God, what's the right answer? And my answer was, which is very true to me, and actually like different than probably a lot of the people I was with, I said, it depends on the week. Which like right. is not necessarily the most rabbinic answer, but I actually have the ability where, I've explored my Judaism, and so there are weeks where I am I keep Shabbat to maybe a more traditional way, and other weeks where I don't, because I've seen it in all of these ways. Right. But in their minds, they're like, keeping Shabbat looks one way. There's only one way you can do these things. And so you sometimes have to just remember that we all also, and I think this is maybe larger messaging too, we only know what we know. Sometimes we haven't been exposed to as much of the things that we think we should have been. And like, you do have to slow down and think like global, like, what have I been exposed to? Like, what do I actually know? And yes, we can learn and learn and learn, but some people don't have every opportunity. They don't have time to spend and do a lot of those things.
Oh, for sure. The ability to shul shop, right? Or the ability to just be like, oh, where am I davening this week?
Right.
That was something that I even took for granted as a rabbinical student in New York, is like, sometimes we would go to shul just based on like where we were going to dinner because it was the closest place. Yeah. Like, think of like, to some people in a community where like there's one choice, it's just like, that's the most mind-blowing, like you don't even like, maybe the davening is not as good, or maybe it's not actually where you identify in your own Judaism, right? But it's still like, that's the closest place to dinner, is like the craziest thing in the world. Yeah. I'm also thinking of this great scene from one of my favorite Israeli shows, Surugim. It's just
I need to watch it. So, I know. I think it's come up a number of times, and I have to watch it.
That's so good. But they're having a conversation, this guy and his wife, about some halachic issue. I don't know. I think it's like, can they go to a shiva during Sheva Brachot or something like that? They're just recently married. Yeah. And the wife calls one rabbi, and then he's like, no, you can't. And then he's like, oh, call this other rabbi. I think he'll give you, like, that's like the ability to say, like, I know which rabbi is going to give me the answer I want. it was like, that's American Judaism and Israeli Judaism to a T,
Yeah.
right? Where there's so much diversity of thought and diversity of opinion that you can use it to your own convenience, which is so outside the box of like so many communities, Jewish communities around the world.
I mean, there were a few of the young people we were speaking with that actually said, because I was there, it was during Passover, and I keep strict Passover, and it was and I was with Reform rabbinical students, and so at one point, I think even one of the students said to like the group of, "Oh, Jessica's more religious than we are to some extent," which is like, for people who don't understand and have never seen, they've seen a little bit or maybe know of more Reform or egalitarian sort of Judaism, of what that looks like, because they have that, some of that exposure, but to some extent a few of the people like couldn't wrap their heads around it, of like, well, but you guys are the rabbis.
Right.
And
right.
like, I'm not a rabbi. I didn't go to rabbinical school, but like the way in which we conduct ourselves by their I hate to say standard isn't the right word, but like their exposure of what Judaism can look like.
Right.
So I think like that was, I think, it was learning for all of us in the moment. It was sort of like oh, right. Like, again, I mean, for some, and not knowing what to think about it. So yeah, I mean, and then you flip it also of my experience in Dubai, where there literally is one place that all the Jews are, and like they're diverse. It was a group of diverse Jews from all over the world, and trying to figure out how do you be everything to everyone, which if you've ever planned a program, that's not the way to have a really great program, is to be everything to everyone. You can't really do it. You have to, not make someone upset, but like ultimately, I think it was a very different learning experience of how do you, and I always say it's like looking at the past and the present, and like Dubai is somewhat of the future of how do we take all these diverse people and places where they're from, and like bring them together to make something super meaningful for everyone. But it's super challenging.
So I was just going to do that same transition to talk about Dubai a little bit, because I think, I mean, in addition to this being a cultural question, it's also a political question in a lot of different ways, right? And I mean, obviously in Israel, no one cares if you're Jewish because it's the Jewish state, right? I mean, there's a lot of complicated things to say about that, but
generally speaking,
for this, right, for generally speaking, it's kind of a given. And in America, as you know, there's different pockets of anti-Semitism and different things that rear their head, but it's also the most culturally out there we've ever been as a people, right? Yeah. So that there's people, I mean, there was this study that came out a few years ago where it was just like religious groups that people think highest of in America, and Jews were at the top.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you the great majority of the people who are like, I love Jews, weren't talking about people davening as synagogues, but we're talking about like their favorite Jewish characters and movies and different things like that. No doubt about it. But there's a political advantage to just being able to be doing the things you're doing. And to celebrate your Judaism in whatever way that looks like, even if it's, weird and kind of even offensive in some ways, it's still like, you guys are okay, you're fine. But in a place like Dubai, where you talk about in the article too, like so many people who are living there would never say they're Jewish.
Right.
So how do you make a community, and how do you focus on what it means to be able to create a Jewish community or enhance a Jewish community when there's still an element of secrecy there?
It's hard. And sometimes when I do talk about things in Dubai, I am sensitive to the community that's there, just because they are a small community in this place where they're also somewhat sensitive. But ultimately, I mean, I think as much as you get 2 Jews and 3 opinions, you get that in Dubai also with the Jews who are there, who there are some who do very much more openly speak about their Judaism to coworkers, or sort of like share different things. You also have some people who are, based on the type of work they do and where they need to go, really do keep it that much of a secret. and it's also something that I think has changed over the course of 10, 20 years. And there's like differences. I mean, I was there, and there was a professor from one of the universities in Israel that was actually visiting for a conference, and he was like the chair of the conference. He was like really cute 80-year-old man that had traveled to Dubai, and he was like, it's changed so much in 10 years. They actually put where I'm from in the booklet. So like they had put Israel, like Jerusalem, Israel. And so it's changed. A lot of it is changing. And that's also where it's like, okay, you can say something one day and we don't know it's going to look. And I think for the Jewish people who are in Dubai, like once they find the community, the fact that there's a place or people they can go and that there is something that connects them is so, so important. And it is the thing that connects them, even if how they practice is really different, because one comes from Belgium and one comes from Australia and one comes from Switzerland and also Morocco. And like, this is like, they are literally all coming with different traditions and different foods that they eat. But the fact is that, again, they find some sort of camaraderie just by the fact that you can like walk in the door and know, oh, I'm around like other Jews. You know, I talked to a guy that probably the first weekend I was there, who he basically was like, I come for the food. Like, I'm not like, I would never go. I mean, who half the Jews we know are going to go to any program for the food. And I was like, so it's no different. It's just for him, he's like, not some way. A lot of the folks in Dubai may not be people who would go to shul in their home cities, but because it's a place where like you feel different when you're walking the streets, or you just want to, you know, have challah, or you want to, you know, have some conversation about something Jewish. I think it's like again, it was a completely different type of experience than, you know, typical, you know, Eastern Europe or somewhere else.
No, I think that's very cool. And in some ways, it's also what I think we really need. Like, even in places that have well-established kind of standards of ethnic Judaism, right? Like, kind of like Detroit is very Ashkenazi normative, right? Yeah. There's so many people coming from Russia and Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine here. And that's like a lot of different places too. And I'm reminded of this really great minyan in New York on the Upper West Side that I don't know if it's still there or if they've moved or not, but they shared a building with where Kehillat Hadar used to daven. Okay. And it was just a Sephardic minyan. That's just what they called it. That was like, I forgot if they had a name or not, but it was a Sephardic minyan, which you expect with like Spanish and Portuguese, right? But when you go in there, there's like someone who's reading Torah who's like Moroccan. The lay leader who's davening is Italian, which they would never even call themselves Sephardic Jews. Like, right. Italian Jews are their own thing, and they would never be called Sephardic. And there's like Yemenite. There are all these different people who are all coming, but with under the umbrella of pretty much just not Ashkenazi. Right. And those folks found common ground, just the ability to share different experiences, but knowing that so much of different cities are influenced by the fact that there's so much Ashkenazi Judaism that permeates everything. Yeah. So one of the questions I have then is like, when you come back to Detroit after all of these experiences and you come back to, you know, the kiddushes that you remember, the communities that you remember, where this city in 4 years, I can tell you, like, I'm still learning every single day, but congregants were related to these congregants, were related to these congregants from different synagogues who all grew up and used to be part of this synagogue, but they all eventually went back to, they were all from Hungary, or they were all from like, we used to be on Belle Isle with these different folks who were also Greeners, and like all of these families who all go back, but have a very strong Ashkenazi focus here. And then there's like the small little community of Keter Torah. It's like a beautiful community has like that Sephardic element, which stands out in a really beautiful way, but also has to feel kind of lonely in some ways too, right? Of this is such an Ashkenazi city. Where is it good to keep hold of that kind of ethnic Judaism and embrace it and say, this is such an important part of who we are? because I do feel like that's an important part of who we are. And so I'm going to go back to the article. You had this story about traveling from Krakow to Warsaw, I think, and you were on the train.
Yep.
And you had this moment of being like, wow, this is where like my grandparents know this landscape. Like this was what they saw. This is part of who I am. And like when you take that back and you say like, that's a palpable, like I even just saying that out loud just gave me some chills.
Yeah.
Because I feel that too. And there's something special about that. But also, what do you do to hold on to the parts that are your own ethnic Judaism, while also saying, here's global Judaism, here are these different communities and pockets that have vibrant, beautiful cultures of how they're celebrating their Jewish life, and to make room for that, and not even just make room in like a really significant way, but to even just say like, let's go a little bit beyond America and Israel, or beyond Ashkenazi Judaism, you know?
I have all sorts of different thoughts.
That was a really scattered question, but
all of these things, it's like my brain goes in all the good directions. I do think there's one element of things being so like, and the amount that we tap into the Ashken normative sort of piece of whatever we're talking about. I think today that a lot of at least young people, or people our age and probably younger, are like probably to some extent disconnected from some of the Ashken normativeness, if so we can expand that word, of what's like, what does it actually mean? Meaning like, we talk about if being Ashkenazi is about bagels and kugels and brisket, but like why? And why do we actually eat those foods? And I actually, I mean, it's one of the things, like I'm grateful that I knew a bit about my background before I was doing this travel of, and there's stuff I wish, I mean, I had multiple moments where I was like, man, I really wish my grandparents were still alive, that I could ask them these questions. And like, wow, like I you know, one passed away when I was young. So it's like, and my parents have shared and wrote down stories, and we have a lot of those things. So thankfully, like I have some knowledge of, and it was my grandparents, or at least 3 of the 4 of them were born in Eastern Europe and were not born in the States. Whereas today you have generations where it's a couple generations back that are from these places. And so I do think there's an element of, we have to like learn, we still have to do the work to learn about where we're from and to visit these places, like learn those stories and figure out, are you from there, and what does it mean to be Ashkenazi? Like you know, I think I was talking with a friend when I got back, and I had said something about eating Russian food, or maybe it was either whether I make kreplach or whether I make whatever type of food it is. And you go to, I mean, if you're in Poland, you're going to eat pierogies, or you're going to eat like foods that your parents may have made or your grandparents made of Russian food. It's on the menu. Like and it's not just Jews eating that food. Like, it's not really like it's Jewish food, but it's actually like food from these places, because I'm Polish in some like regard. I don't necessarily know that I feel Polish, but like that's an element of the history. And I think we disconnect that a lot, or at least like, because we can't touch and feel it as much, because we've lost a lot of the people who are actually from these places, or our grandparents are, you know, if we've been here for a few generations, that exists. And we have to open ourselves up to then learn about other places and cultures, and that this isn't the only Jewish story. I think it's actually probably harder for us as Americans, because we do take all of these things for granted. So we do feel like we can go anywhere. I do think I'd like argue that maybe sometimes it's not that we open ourselves too much, but that if you, again, try to be everything for everyone in one space, then you're going to lose that tradition somehow, some way. You're not going to have that same, you have to work to keep some of those traditions alive. And so I do question or wonder a lot, like, if we are making everything so, you know, like intersecting and trying to find all these ways, then where is that thread that still keeps us connected to other places and globally? And I mean, that was definitely for me what I learned throughout the years. Like, it's sometimes a very thin thread today, but we have to find those things that keep us connected. But it's I mean, it's challenging. I don't think there's like that's the hard piece, because you also have so many people that are coming from different places, and you know, it's again recognizing what history looks like, in that people just didn't, in terms of who they married someone from their same town because you couldn't connect with it. I mean, it was literally like you didn't have mail service to let, you know, an email to stay connected, or Zoom. So in terms of who you were exposed to, and the lack of diversity in some regard, was a function of like where you are.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's something like we have to grapple with, but I also always am trying to hope, like, how can we keep that tradition with us? Like, how can we keep hold of this one thread? Because how wonderful, like, if we go as American Jews, take it to some other place that's so broad and open, how can we still connect in to the global Jewish community? Because in some of these communities, there's also just not the numbers of people, you know, to create 4 synagogues or to create 17 different organizations in their community of 2,000 Jews. Like, how do you hold on to, I mean, and that's, I was actually at like a small Jewish communities conference of European communities, and the conference was in Florence, Italy. And it was all people representing communities of under 5,000 Jews, maybe.
It was all like Eastern European communities?
Sorry? All European, yeah. So Venice, Italy, Florence, Italy, Helsinki, Amsterdam, somewhere outside of Amsterdam, like all these places where like they're not necessarily small cities.
Right.
Some of those cities have their own, you know, similar, I'd say, to Detroit, and like it was a space I walked into and sometimes had something to share of like, this seems like a similar experience of Detroit, and Detroit had a downturn and a resurgence, but also recognizing again, like, for some of these communities, even in Detroit's downturn, and there were people leaving, there was still over 50,000 Jews. Like in some of those places, you go from 2,000 and all the young people leave, and there's no opportunities. And then how do you hold on? And I had actually flipped the question, whereas are they keeping it alive and vibrant for me? Or are they focusing on how to actually keep it alive and vibrant for their local community? And I think that's like a real question too, of how much, like, when we travel, and it's so amazing to go to, I always wanted to go to the local synagogue, but is it more important for them to greet visitors from all these other places? And that can be, if you've got groups and all of these things and people coming to visit, or do they stay alive so that they, like, are they trying to bolster their own and internally figure out who they are and what they want for a community, which I think is like a totally whole nother conversation, but like really a relevant thing.
Yeah, and I feel so badly that I haven't even really thought about that. But I mean, like, yeah, I lived in Florence for a year, and I didn't even really think about, other than like during high holidays and different things, like that was really the only time the synagogue would even open in Florence.
Right.
And so instead of being like, wow, I wonder what the Jewish community is like here, all of the people in my program, all the Jews in my program, we just found each other.
Right.
And like, yeah, now I have good Jewish guilt, like looking back on that and not like learning more about the community. But no, like later in my life, I really embraced that too. And like what a missed opportunity that was. And I took this really great Italian Judaism class in grad school that like made me want to go back and kind of live a year in a different way again. But I mean, that's really, like, that hits viscerally. I think that that's a really good point. And this is my last opinion, and I'll let you
sure.
agree with me, disagree with me, say I'm crazy. But I think in some ways too, like, we also don't have a right to just be able to say like, oh, this is who I am, unless you actually learn about it and like care more about it. We also take just our own blood and our own roots for granted in a lot of different ways, where with such a vibrant Ashkenazi community in Detroit, there's a shockingly small number of people who speak Yiddish, who know where their communities are from, who can make the food that they claim to love. Like there's so much. My dear friend Rabbi Alex Braver, who I had on for our second one of these, always said something that I really love and teach all the time because I think it's great. He had a congregant back in New York who came up to him and was complaining about something about Judaism and saying how he hates being Jewish or something. And Alex responded back by saying, you don't know enough about Judaism to hate yourself. Like, learn about Judaism and then you can hate yourself all you want for being Jewish. But if you don't understand what it even is to be Jewish, you just were born this way and you haven't gone into your roots or your depths, how can you hate yourself? And then he's like, if you learn about it, hate yourself all you want. There's a lot of reasons that we can hate ourselves, right? As being self-loathing Jews. But to be able to say like, you know what, Masorah is important, tradition is really important, and we should really just double down on our Masorah is also like, okay, but that's a charge for us all to double down on our Masorah. That's like, we also have to do the work then.
I feel like I saw it any number of times, and it's also a little bit, I guess, of how like my own Jewish evolution and my own like exploring who am I and what do I know about Judaism and what do I still want to learn, and gratitude towards like my parents who raised me the way they did. And so I had some of these tools in my like back pocket to to observe in this way. And I think it's so true. It's when you're born into like you're Jewish. You don't have to ask any questions necessarily. And I do think even, especially in the former Soviet Union, that's why it's so interesting to watch. And in Eastern Europe and like some of these places where you have people who are excited to learn, like they want to learn or discover that they're Jew, like that discovery. I always have shared the story, and there's lots of different I'm sure lots of different stories out there of hearing the people who are, whether they're in Poland or Ukraine, Russia, throughout there are people who learn they're Jewish at 15, at 30, at 45. In Warsaw at their JCC, the girl who is like the front desk sort of welcoming person, she said probably about once a month they have someone who walks in and says, I just discovered I'm Jewish for any number of reasons. Now what?
Right.
And to me, I'm like, right, so where do you start? And where do you start when you haven't grown up this way? If someone said to you, hey, you're not what you think you are, and you're this entirely other thing, and so now like take on all the baggage that comes with that, but also like, what do you learn? Which traditions do you want to connect to? And I do think that's where like a lot of us, what it actually means to be Jewish, I don't know if we know what it means to be Jewish. And I don't know that I know what it means to be Jewish. And it's like, you might know the prayers, but what are you saying? And if you actually, and that's, I did spend a lot of time this year, like I celebrated Shabbat in some way every week. And I found it in myself to like teach myself some different things and learn because I said, wow, like, you know what? I know I can read Hebrew, and I know Hebrew, and I know the language, but I can speak it. Like I can't have a conversation. And why do I know it? Because I know the prayers. But what do the prayers mean?
Right.
And that's like this sort of, it might be it's a whole nother conversation of like conservative Judaism also of what I was raised on. But like, 100%. I think there's something in us of where do we start, and then what else can we learn? And it's I think in looking at young people today, especially how do we connect to our heritage? Like I do think, and how do we connect to history is also starting to learn about like what is Judaism to you, and learn some, like, it's my two, like, I guess, continual themes of the year. One is learn something, ask something, learn about someone different than you, and learn about yourself. Like, I think they go hand in hand. Like, you have to know about yourself and your own history to also have appreciation and learn more about those that are different. And I think when we focus on what actually makes us all similar, which sometimes you have to learn what, like an Orthodox Jew and a Reformed Jew and a conservative Jew and an egalitarian and a this Jew and that Jew, like what actually like makes us similar? Where do we all agree? What are those spaces that I think are really, really important to find and exist? It's just like we put all these sort of the labels, and I'll say, especially this came to me in Dubai, of what conservative Judaism means in America is different than what it might mean in another country. And when you talk about, I mean, we were talking about building some sort of non-Orthodox service, but what reform is different than progressive, is different than egalitarian, is different than like there's 15 different names. And then you're like, okay, so what do we all actually want? Like what, I mean, that what's similar? So yeah, I think, I mean, I think I just said 47 things, but like it's bigger questions of how do we learn? I mean, I think you have to learn and to not think, we think very communally based. And I think sometimes it's also important to think individually and learn, and globally.
Awesome. That just opened up a million more questions and things I wanted to say. But
I tend to do that.
No. So let's, you know what, we'll have you back and we'll continue the conversation, because that would be awesome. My mind's racing right now, and that's a good thing.
Good.
So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
really.
My
This
pleasure.
Was really, really great. And again, read the article. It's very good. I mean, it's really, really fascinating. I learned things in it that we didn't talk about when we got coffee, and I'm glad that I read it. And
there's still a lot of reflect. I think like every week I have different reflections, or I think about a different week, continually it's evolving and changing. So
awesome. And again, we're going to put on the link to your writings too, just so everyone can catch up on everything that you did too. Awesome. Great. So cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It's honestly like so fun for me to talk about, and then also like gets me thinking. And again, one of my goals, like going back to your very first question, one of my goals for the year was how much can I learn this year so that I can share it. Like this is part of the whole thing, is that I want to like answer people's questions and share stories and do those things, because I think that's how we all learn.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you for sharing and for teaching us. And we have a lot more to talk about. So We'll do it again.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.